Okay. So Boker Tov. So today's Daf Yomi is Bava Kamma Nun Tes, Bava Kamma 59. We're going to start in today's Daf Yomi 59a, around 10 lines from the top, or the Gemara is discussing a brisa, a source that talked about if your animal accidentally damages the crops in another person's property, how do we determine it? How do we determine how you have to pay? And we saw a lot of different opinions. One of the opinions was the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Rabbi Yossi Aglili had said, and we covered this at the bottom of yesterday's daf, that we look at the Meshuyar Shabo. What does that mean? We look at, the way Rashi explains it, let's say the goat ate grapes. We look at what it would be worth when it was harvested. Meaning to say, if the animal came down and destroyed half-eaten grapes, we don't look at the value of what those half-eaten grapes right now would be selling for in the market. If your animal, Kobe, let's just say, falls onto somebody else's crops and they ruin the crops, you could look at it what those crops are worth now or what you expected them to be worth. So Rabbi Yossi Aglili is saying we don't look at them at what they're worth right now, because right now they're worth not anywhere near what we're expecting them to be worth. We're expecting them to be worth a lot more. And so therefore that's what Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, b'meshuyar shabo. It's what we expect them to be worth. So now comes along Abaye on 59a, 59a, 10 lines to the top. Amar Abaye, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Rabbi Yishmael, Amru Davar Echad. He said, Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Yishmael said the same thing. Now we have to see, by understanding what Rabbi Yishmael said, we're going to better understand what Rabbi Yossi Aglili said. So Rabbi Yossi Aglili Hada Amran. Rabbi Yossi Aglili, that which we said, that you don't look at the crops what they're worth now, but we look at what we expect them to be worth. Rabbi Yishmael, the Tanya, what did Rabbi Yishmael say? It says in the Brisa, Meitav Sadeh Meitav Karmo Yishalem. From the best of his field and the best of his vineyard, he shall pay. Meitav Sadeh Meitav Karmo Yishalem. From the best of his field and the best of his vineyard, he shall pay. What does that mean? Meitav Sadeh shall nizak, Meitav Karmo shall nizak. From the best of the field of the one who was damaged, and Meitav Karmo shall nizak. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. So Rabbi Yishmael says you pay by the best value. So basically, the understanding is your animal damaged somebody else's crops, but you don't know how much, what the damage was, because he has different levels of crops. So basically, you looked at, he has different levels of crops out there, and you assume he attacked the best and not the worst. That's what Rabbi Shmuel says. Whereas Rabbi Akiva, and basically that's the same idea as what Rabbi Yossi Aglili is saying, because you look at it as what you expect it to grow to, not what it's worth necessarily right now. Whereas Rabbi Akiva takes the opposite approach. He says, "Lo ba'akasav elagvos unizakim min ha'idis mekal v'chomer lahektish." He says, Rabbi Akiva says, no. What the pasuk is telling us is that you collect for the nizakin from the edis. You collect for the damages from the best of the person, the damager's field. And for sure, for hektish, if you dedicate something to the temple and you say, I'm giving my field to the temple, and then it turns out you have multiple levels of fields, we take your best field for the temple, not from your worst field. Below tema, but don't say that Rabbi Yossi Aglili holds like Rabbi Idi Bar Abin. Number of Idi Bar Abin gon shal acha arucha bein arugos v'lo yadina nikachusha have ishmeina have. To Amar kum shlem shmeina b'meita. Don't say that Rabbi Yishmael says that it's like Rabbi Idi Bar Abin said that if you ate from somebody's field, and we don't know if you ate from the worst of the crops or the best of the crops, that we say go pay him from the best of the crops, because why? Because that case is different. My time, because we say basically, so what he's saying is so what Abaye is saying is that there's two ways to understand what Rabbi Yishmael said, and it's not the way I actually had explained it before. That Rabbi Yishmael says that when it says in the verse you have to pay from the best of his field and the best of his crops, you might have thought it means, okay, since we don't know which of his crops were ruined, we assume it was the best of the crops. No, we don't say that. We say it means look at what the crops will eventually be worth, and then you pay it. And that's exactly what Rabbi Yossi Aglili is saying. We don't value, if you're trying to figure out the money that you owe for the damage, we don't look at the damage you actually did now, but we look at what the crops are expected to grow to, and that's how we calculate the damages. So that's obviously disadvantageous to the damager himself. Like, can you imagine, like, basically, let's just say, to give you the example, let's say you have a guy who's a basketball player in high school, and a car runs him over, and he says, well, I'm going to sue you for damages. Well, you say, well, right now, what's your damages? I'm a basketball player. I don't make any money. I'm in high school. Yeah, but I'm expected to go to the Division I and get an NLI deal, an NIL deal. And I'm going to go to the NBA. And my expectation is that this is what I'm going to be worth. That's basically what we're assuming here. So now, you had a question, Harold?
Damage someone's crop, and if they spent thousands of hours between March and September tending to the crop, it would be a certain extent. And now the crop is ruined, that they also don't have to spend it.
The Talmud's about to bring up that exact point. Okay, so we're going to get to that, Harold. Now, Amar Mar, Rabbi Shimon Yehuda says, Mishum Rabbi Shimon. Now we quote another statement from the source that we had just said, which is that Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda said in the name of Rabbi Shimon, Samed Devar Mamurim Sha'acha Lulave Gefanim Vichure Te'enim. He says, Rabbi Shimon says that when do we evaluate how much it was worth versus how much it's worth now? That's when he ate the grape shoots or the fig shoots. But if he ate the half figs or the half grapes, we look at it as though they're grapes ready to be harvested, and we give them the higher valuation. So, but that means to say that when it's grapevines and grape shoots, we compare the depreciation. But if it was a smadar, but if it was a half grape, we look at it as though it was a grape ready to be harvested. But ema seifa. But the next clause implies achapagim oboser. The next statement says that if he eats these half grapes or half figs, that's when he views them as though it was ready to be harvested. Hasmada, but if it was just a budding grape, then we look at what the field was worth versus what it's worth now. So there's the implication of a statement can be read either way. So how do we read it? So it says Ravina Kroch Vatani. No, we have to read it all together. When do we say this statement that we look at the field, what it's worth, what it was worth, and what it's worth now? That's where he ate the shoots. But if he ate the budding grapes or the half grapes, we look at them as what they would be worth when they were being harvested. So therefore we look at it as though they'd be worth when they're being harvested, and then obviously it's a much higher valuation. So now the Gemara says, so if that's the case, Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Shimon bar Yehuda are both saying we look at the grapes as though, even though you did the damage now, as though what they're worth when they're fully harvested. That's in fact the exact same thing as Rabbi Yoshua. Gemara says, no, but now there's a distinction between them, kachash gufana. Whether or not you pay, this is what Harold was getting to, whether or not you pay when you look at the grapes and what their value, you look at what their value will be when they're fully harvested, but there's also the negative that they're drawing sustenance from the grapevines. So do we have to take into account in this calculation the deterioration or the depletion of the nutrients or the strength of the grapevine, which has deteriorated? And we don't know who says what. Abai says, actually, we do know who says what. Mantana dechayesh kachash kufana. Who's the one who says we have to be worried about the deterioration of the grapevine in calculating the costs of the damage? So therefore, you deduct that from the costs. That's Rabbi Shimon ben Yehudi. The Tanya Rabbi Shimon Yehuda says, Rabbi Shimon ben Asya, ones enu mishalim as atzar, sofo etzar. He says that in ones, he says, Rachmano Etzlan, a woman who is assaulted, she doesn't have to pay. Now, when a woman loses her virginity, there's certain pain involved. So she doesn't have to pay for such pain, because in the end, she would have been suffering that pain anyway when she lost her virginity with her husband. So therefore you could deduct that pain from the costs. So Amrullah responded to him, no, we don't. That's not a good logic. You can't compare a woman who goes through that pain because she wants to be with her husband with a woman who goes through that pain when she doesn't want to. But anyway, we see from here that he says when you calculate the costs, you could deduct the future, debt, so to speak. Amar Abaye, what? Depreciation. I don't know if it's depreciation exactly. That's why I wasn't going to use the word, because it's negative negative, right? In the loss column. Cost of production. Amar Abaye, Hani Tanai Rabbi Shimon Yehuda Amru Davar Echad. So he said there's another position when they say something similar to Rabbi Shimon Yehuda. That's Rabbi Shimon Yehuda Adam. And Hani Tanai Mai, the Tanya Rabbi Yossi says Nichichaya. So this is the case of where Rahman al-Tzlan, a man strikes a woman who's pregnant, and then the person whose wife lost her baby goes to the court and says, you have to pay me for the damages. It says, I'll pay you for the damages, but I'm deducting the $5,000 that I would have had to pay in hospital expenses to the OBGYN because now you don't have to pay it. So I'm deducting that cost. So Ben Azai says, not only that, Nechim Zonos, I also can deduct when she's pregnant, she eats more. So I can deduct that cost also from the cost of what I have to pay, because now you don't have to pay for the cost of your pregnancy. I mean, these things sound very harsh and barbaric, but the American courts go through the same thing when they have to calculate how much you owe with respect to damages. So, the one that says you deduct the cost of the midwife, for sure you deduct the cost of the food you'd have to pay for the pregnant woman. And one that says you just deduct the cost of the food, but you don't deduct the cost of the midwife. Why? Because the man whose wife was pregnant could say, I said, I don't need a midwife. My wife knows how to give birth without a doctor. She could give birth on her own in the back seat of our car. She knows exactly what to do. I'm not paying for no doctor. They calculated like Rav Nachman that they looked at this case, and even though it was just a case where the person himself did the damage, they didn't calculate the damages against the tree itself, but they calculated by saying it was in a field 60 times the size. They took a palm tree and they compared it to the rest of the land. So basically, by an Aramean palm tree, we that's what we do. But by a Persian palm tree, then we rule like the Reish Galusa, who says that we look at the palm tree just by itself, and we don't imagine it's in a much larger field. Now we have a very powerful story. Eliezer Zeira have a Sayim Nasani. Eliezer Zeira, now why is the name Zeira? Zeira means a small one. He was a very humble man. So he was wearing black shoes. Rashi says black shoes are a sign of mourners. Now, Tosfos points out everybody used to wear black shoes, but he was wearing black shoes and black laces, which was a sign of mourning. He's walking around the marketplace of Nardai dressed like a mourner. Now, he wasn't a mourner, and he's walking around like he's a mourner. So basically, it's almost, you have to imagine he's like a civil rights activist. He's an activist in the street. Remember, Mordechai was dressed wearing the sackcloth in a place you weren't allowed to. It means you're not happy with society. You're not happy with society. So our old friends, the Reish Galusa, the political party, they found them. Black shoes. Amaru to come out Vilna Yerushalayim. He says, I'm crying for Jerusalem. Amaru, who do you think you are to cry for Jerusalem? You're nobody. You don't have the right to go walk around in your mourning clothes crying for Jerusalem. Savar Yuara Have. They thought it was Yuara. What's Yuara? Do you know what Yuara is? Yuara is where you act with, like you adopt upon yourself these very religious practices, and it's like you're thinking you're better than people. Like so some rabbis said you're not allowed to wear your tzitzis out because it's arrogant. So it depends. If it's a place where nobody wears their tzitzis out, then it's arrogant for you to wear your tzitzis out. So this is the question. So they said this guy is acting arrogant, haughty. Asua v'chavshua. They took him and they put him in prison. Amrlu Gava Rabba Ana. He said, "Who do you think you are? You think I can't act like I'm mourning? I'm a great man." Now, the only reason why he's saying he's a great man is because he's trying to teach them. Amrulay Minaya Dina. And they said to him, "How would we know?" Amrlu Oh Atun Ba Minay Milso Anai Ba Minay Milso. He says, "Either you ask me a question or I'll ask you a question." And so they said to him, Amrulay Bayat. They said to him, "You asked the question." Amrulu, he says to them, Haiman the katz kufra, my mishayim. So he said, a man who cuts down a kufra. A kufra is it's basically an unripe date. What does he have to pay if he cuts down the unripe date? Amrulay mishayim to make kufra. So he says, pay for the unripe date. Gemara says, Va'avi tamri. But so he says, but it's going to become a date. Amrulay says, mishayim to make Torah. He says, pay for the date. Amrulay va'alav tamri shaka. But he didn't take a date. So what does he pay? Amrulay, Amalan. Okay, you tell us. Amalan not. Amrulay b'shishim. He says, no, you look at the field as though it was 60 times the amount, and now what's it worth now as opposed to what it was worth then? Amrullah, man amar kavasach. They said, who told you that? Amrullah, ha-shmuel chayu beis dino kaim. Shmuel's alive, and his court is still in existence. Shadru kamei de Shmuel. They sent him to Shmuel. Amrullah, shapir kamarlahu. Yeah, this Eliezer Zeira is speaking great. B'shishim, he says, that's how you calculate it by 60 times the amount of Vishavku, and they let him go. We see from here, this man took upon himself to mourn for Jerusalem. You have to understand, the markets of Nardai, very, like it's like the fancy part of town, and he's going in there mourning, and he had the right to do it. The Reish Galusa says, no, we don't need Jerusalem. We've got the Reish Galusa here. He showed them. Rabbi Shimon says that if you ate actual fruits, you pay actual fruits. You pay the exact value what you ate. You don't go to the whole field. My time, and what's his reasoning? Because it says in Torah, you go into another field, means to say, when the Torah says you go into another field and compare it to another field, that is only that's something that still needs the field, but these full fruits that he ate, they don't need a whole field. You should just pay exactly what they're worth. Amar Avuna Barchi, Amar Yari Baraba, Dan Rav Rabbi Meir, Pasach Rabbi Shimon. So he says that Rav ruled like Rabbi Meir, and he ruled like Rabbi Shimon. What does it mean he ruled like Rabbi Meir? Dan Rav Rabbi Meir, the Tanya. So this is very, we had this back in Ksuvah, so it's just a reminder. Kasav Rishon v'lo chasmalo, l'sheni v'chasmalo avda Ksuvasa, Divrei Rabbi Meir. So basically, we know that a husband, when he gets married to a woman, he has to give her his whole ksuba. He's mortgaging all of his property to pay her first. Everything he has is mortgaged to pay his wife first. But let's say he's short of cash, so he wants to sell that property. He can only do it with her permission. But let's say he wants to sell a field to a person, and she doesn't sign off on it. But then the second one, and she signs off on it. So Avda Ksuvasa, from the fact that she signed off on the second one, she loses her right to claim, I was just doing it to make my husband happy. Because if she was just doing it to make her husband happy, she would have done the first one. So her mayor says she lost her ksuba there. Because from the fact that she didn't do it the first time and she did the second time, it shows that she wasn't worried about her husband. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says, no, she still hasn't lost her ksuba. She could still say, I was just trying to make my husband happy. Maybe the first time I didn't care, but the second time I was just trying to make my husband happy. So Rabbi Yehuda says she doesn't lose it, but Rabbi Meir says she lost it by her actions. And we rule, and Rav rules like Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Shimon says, Acha peres gemurim mishalam peres gemurim imsam satam. That if he ate actual fruit, you pay the actual fruit. Now we say the next Mishnah, Magdish b'toch sadeh chavero. Let's say you put your stack of crops in somebody else's field, so bershus without their permission. V'achaltam beimasa shel ba'al sadeh. So you put your crops in my field. My animal comes along and eat it. Butter, I'm not reliable. I'm not responsible. You put it in my property without permission. And not only that, if my animal trips on your vegetables that you stuck in my yard without permission, you're responsible for putting it in my property. But let's say I said you could put it in. Then the Bala saw this life. Then the owner of the field is responsible. So Gemara says, Lema Tanan the Loka Rebbe. Let's say that our Mishnah is not like Rebbe. Dika Rebbe, Ha'ama, Rebbe says, Achi Kabul of Bala Bias Lishmor. He says, no, he has to be explicit saying, you can put it in and I'll watch it. Amar Papa Hacha, no. Here what we're talking about is Benator Beidarias scheme. We're talking about a very specific watchman. The Kivin the Amrway, I of the Gadish, since it says put it in, he means I of Anter. He says put it in and I'll watch it. Okay, the last case for today. The Mishnah says somebody sends a fire. Now we're going up to the laws of fire. Up until now we're talking about animal, now we go to fire. Somebody puts his fire in the hands of a cheresh of katan. It's a person without sound mind. We're going to say, I stick my fire into, Reuben sticks a fire into Shimon's hand. Shimon is a little kid and he goes and causes a fire. Reuben's not responsible by the laws of man, but is liable by the laws of heaven. If Reuben stuck it into an adult, the adult is responsible. Let's say one person brings the fire and the other one brings the wood. Who's responsible? The one who brought the wood is the one who's responsible. Or if the first person brought the wood and the second person brought the fire, the one who brought the fire is responsible. Let's say somebody else comes along and blows on it. The one who blows on the fire is responsible. If the wind blew on it, then kulam patur, and they're all exempt. So when do we say that if you give it into the hands of a child, you're not responsible? When do we say this? Where you gave him just a coal, which is not an active fire, and the child blew on it. Says Reish Lakish, but if you gave him a torch, then you're responsible because your torch is what caused this fire. Rabbi Yochanan says that even if you gave him a torch, he's potter. My time because this child or the deaf mute, by holding it, that's what did it. And you're only not going to be responsible. You give him the thorns. Silta, you give him the what is that? That is the small pieces of wood. Sharga, what? Kindling. Shraga, you give him a fire. Shraga, you ever heard the name Shraga? That's what it is. That's where your actions caused it. Okay, all right. So I'd like to stop the recording here. If anybody has any questions,